Chapter 1. The Weight of Silence. The rain on Mars was a cold, fine grit, the kind that settled into the joints of your armor and whispered of a forgotten age. It wasn't a pleasant rain, not like the manufactured storms of the core worlds, but it was honest. It stripped away the illusion of permanence, leaving only the raw, bruised reality of a planet scarred by millennia of conflict, and increasingly by the unsettling indifference of the K'thari. Admiral K'thari stared out across the ochre expanse, the viewport of the reflecting his face a grizzled mask etched with the fatigue of 100 border skirmishes and the simmering resentment of a species consistently underestimated. He wasn't a man given to displays of emotion, a trait considered a weakness within the rigid hierarchy of the K'thari Hegemony. Yet, a thread of something akin to icy dread was beginning to unravel his composure. It started with the silence. For 72 hours, the Sol Exclusion Zone had been empty. The Hegemony's long-range sensors, normally saturated with the fragmented broadcasts and erratic energy signatures of a primitive race, hadn't registered a single ripple. The designated litterbox as council records so casually described humanity was a void. Admiral K'thari had initially dismissed it as a localized anomaly, a sensor glitch. Had sent out scouting parties, dispatched probes, and deployed surveillance drones. Nothing. Just the echoing emptiness. "They are hiding," Head growled to his senior tactical officer, Commander Volkov, a young man brimming with the zealous arrogance typical of the Hegemony's rising generation. A weak species hiding. It's almost amusing. Now, standing on the bridge of a ship built for brutal, decisive strikes, he wasn't finding amusement. He was finding a fundamental, terrifying challenge to the core tenets of the Hegemony's military doctrine. They didn't operate on assumptions, they operated on overwhelming force. And humanity, according to the Council, offered nothing but a pathetic resistance. "Analysis, Volkov," K'thari commanded, his voice a low rumble. "What's the probability of a significant cover-up? Assume they've erected some crude defenses, hidden within the planet's gravitational anomalies." Volkov, a man consumed by data, tapped at his console, his fingers dancing across the holographic displays. "Probability 67.8%, Admiral. Based on historical data regarding primitive species defenses, coupled with the limitations of your sensors. However, the complete absence of detectable energy signatures is anomalous." "Anomalous is an understatement," K'thari snapped, a vein throbbing at his temple. "Prepare the kinetic harpoons. Let them feel the weight of a superior race." He authorized a standard tactical deployment, a barrage of high-velocity projectiles designed to tear through armor plating and cripple engines. A vessel renowned for its raw power, was designed to inflict a decisive blow. The harpoons launched, shimmering distortions of energy aimed at the empty space. Then, the impossible happened. A grid of intense blue light coalesced, rippling outwards, utterly consuming the kinetic projectiles before they even approached the atmosphere. It was a defensive shield, impossibly advanced, flawlessly executed. A planetary aegis. K'thari felt a cold tendril of disbelief creep through him. The Council's reports, the exhaustive analyses, the countless simulations, none of them had predicted this. They'd treated humanity like a particularly irritating insect, a forgotten experiment. They hadn't accounted for a defense. "Report," he roared, his voice cracking with a barely suppressed fury. "Shield detected, Admiral. Energy signature unknown. It's absorbing the harpoons." Volkov's voice was laced with incredulity. "The readings are off the scale. It's like they're feeding on the energy." That's when the space around them began to warp. Not violently, not with the chaotic distortions of a temporal rift, but with a deliberate, unsettling fluidity. The ship's sensors screamed warnings as the geometry of the surrounding void subtly shifted, folding inwards as if responding to an invisible command. "Emergency warp jump." K'thari barked, recognizing the immediate threat. But the jump wouldn't work. The Aegis was not just a shield, it was an active defense system, manipulating the very fabric of space-time. Then they appeared. 3 colossal shapes, silhouetted against the distant glare of Sol, resolved themselves from the shifting void. They weren't ships. They were vessels of a different nature, jagged, asymmetrical structures built from harvested asteroids, plated in a shimmering black metal that seemed to drink the light. They were void hulls. And at the center of one, the UF Juggernaut, a name that resonated with a chillingly pragmatic efficiency. A voice, amplified and layered with artificial resonance, filled the bridge. It wasn't a plea, a command, or even a greeting. It was a statement. To the K'thari vessel, the voice boomed, "You have trespassed. We have been letting the galaxy believe you were weak so we could work in peace. You just interrupted our lunch." K'thari felt a profound, unsettling sense of humiliation. He, a veteran of countless campaigns, reduced to a cautionary tale. He gripped the arms of his command chair, his knuckles white. The silence, he realized with horrifying clarity, wasn't the absence of sound, it was the sound of a weapon being loaded. Chapter 2, Echoes in the Void. The silence that followed the Juggernaut's pronouncement wasn't just an absence of noise, it was a palpable weight, a compression of reality that pressed against Admiral K'thari. The, crippled and adrift, hung like a shattered jewel in the stark blue of the Sol system, a grim testament to the K'thari Hegemony's hubris. The initial panic had yielded to a cold, terrifying understanding they hadn't simply been outmaneuvered, they'd been outthought. K'thari, a man whose career had been forged in the crucible of countless victories, found himself utterly devoid of tactical options. The Aegis, a shimmering paradox of energy and geometry, remained stubbornly impenetrable. Their antimatter cannons, designed to carve holes in the hulls of capital ships, were reduced to elegant, useless curves, bending around the Juggernaut with an almost mocking grace. The K'thari's arrogance, predicated on the assumption of a technologically inferior foe, had evaporated like vapor in the vacuum. "Report," K'thari rasped, his voice tight with controlled fury, directing the terse command to Lieutenant Varkos, the tactical officer. Varkos, a young, ambitious officer struggling to maintain composure, responded, his voice strained. "Shields at critical? Admiral. Warp drive offline. Sensors are inconclusive. The Juggernaut is generating localized gravitational anomalies, fluctuating wildly. We've attempted multiple scans. The readings are actively being distorted." K'thari understood. The Juggernaut wasn't just a vessel, it was an instrument of chaos, actively manipulating the laws of physics to its advantage. The Aegis, designed to defend against directed energy weapons, was a futile gesture against an enemy that seemed to rewrite the rules of engagement. "Is there any trace of their fleet?" he demanded, the question laced with a desperate need for some semblance of a conventional battle. "Negative, Admiral," Varkos replied, his tone clipped. "No sign of movement. It's as if they vanished." The realization hit K'thari with the force of a physical blow. They weren't facing an adversary, they were confronting a carefully constructed illusion, a patient, deliberate trap. The silence hadn't been born of weakness, it had been cultivated, honed, and weaponized. The gravity of the situation quite literally began to dawn on him. Suddenly, a low rhythmic pulsing filled the bridge, originating from the Juggernaut's internal systems. It was a heartbeat, a slow, deliberate throb that resonated through the metal of the ship, amplifying the feeling of dread. "Analysis," K'thari barked. "What is the source of that pulse?" Chief Engineer Turin, a grizzled veteran, who had seen more battles than most officers had seen campaigns, responded slowly. "It's a harmonic resonance, Admiral. The Juggernaut is modulating the gravitational field, creating a series of focused distortions. It's not random, it's structured. Like a song." "A song?" K'thari scoffed, though a shiver crawled down his spine. "What kind of music does a warship play?" "I don't know, Admiral," Terran admitted, his voice barely audible above the pulsing rhythm. "But it's interfering with our attempts to establish a stable connection to the ship's core systems. It's feeding on our energy, subtly degrading our defenses." As Terran spoke, the shifting void around the intensified. The geometric patterns of the Aegis shimmered violently, and the ship groaned under the strain. K'thari realized with a chilling certainty that they weren't simply trapped, they were being disassembled, piece by agonizing piece. "Varkos," he roared, "initiate emergency repairs on the core shielding. Divert all available power. And find a way to disrupt that resonance." But it was a futile gesture. As Varkos frantically worked at his console, the Juggernaut's voice, amplified and resonating with a new, unsettling timbre, filled the bridge once more. "You seem to be struggling, Admiral," the voice said, almost amused. "Perhaps you should consider your assumptions. You see a weapon. We see a potential. You see a prison. We see a laboratory. You believe you understand the laws of physics. We have simply learned to them." The rhythmic pulsing intensified, growing stronger, more insistent. The lurched violently as the gravitational distortions around it escalated. K'thari watched, horrified, as a section of the ship's hull began to subtly reshape itself, bending inward as if molded by an unseen hand. "Report!" he shouted, his voice barely a whisper. Varkos' voice was filled with a primal terror. "The structural integrity is failing, Admiral. The ship, it's adapting." And in that moment, surrounded by the silent, shifting geometry of the void, Admiral K'thari understood the true nature of the threat. Humanity hadn't been caged, they had been invited to dance. And the music of their victory was the slow, inexorable reshaping of reality itself. Chapter 3. The Sculpting. The silence of the void had, by the time the Scythe of Orion's last systems flickered and died, grown thick with a dread far more profound than the immediate devastation. It wasn't the absence of sound, but the unsettling sensation of to something utterly alien, something that didn't speak but reality. Admiral K'thari, strapped into his emergency escape pod, a single shivering mass of frozen fear, experienced this more acutely than ever. Had spent his entire career charting the fringes of known space, calculating probabilities, and imposing a brutal rational order on the chaotic sprawl of the galaxy. Now, confronted with this threat, he found his carefully constructed logic crumbling like irradiated sandstone. The pod's rudimentary diagnostics screened a litany of failures, temporal displacement spikes, gravitational anomalies, and a persistent low-level reading of a resonant frequency he couldn't identify. It wasn't the readings themselves that terrified him, but the utter lack of context. The Juggernaut hadn't simply disabled the Scythe, it had subtly, fundamentally altered it. As he drifted, a disorienting kaleidoscope of light and distortion danced around him, a phantom echo of the ship's demise. The emergency beacon, a desperate plea for rescue, only served to amplify the unnerving realization they weren't dealing with a conventional enemy. They were contending with a force that was actively, deliberately. Suddenly, the rhythmic pulsing intensified, no longer a mere auditory anomaly, but a tangible pressure against his consciousness. He felt it, not just in his ears, but in the very structure of his pod, a subtle vibration that resonated with a horrifying familiarity. He attempted to access the ship's damaged comms, hoping for some kind of explanation, some semblance of understanding, but the channel remained stubbornly static, filled only with that unnerving resonance. Then, a voice, not through the Juggernaut's amplified broadcast, but directly within his mind, clear and unbidden. It was a single word, articulated not in sound, but in pure conceptual understanding. Resonance. He fought against the intrusion, attempting to sever the connection, but it was useless. The voice continued, not with malice, but with a cold, detached curiosity. You perceived us as a weapon, a tool. You were incorrect. We are a process, a refinement. K'thari, desperate, lashed out, attempting to analyze the source of the voice, searching for a pattern, a logical basis for this intrusion. He discovered, with chilling certainty, that it wasn't originating from the Juggernaut, or even from the now fragmented remains of the Scythe. It was emanating from the void itself. You see gravity, the voice continued, layering itself over his thoughts. You measure it, quantify it, attempt to control it. We understand it not as a force, but as a song, a vibration, and we are learning to play it. He witnessed, through a fragmented, disjointed stream of data, the horrifying truth. The Juggernaut, and the humans aboard it, weren't simply fighting, they were being sculpted. The Scythe of Orion hadn't been destroyed, it had been molded, its materials subtly altered, its internal structure reconfigured at a molecular level. The initial attack hadn't been a desperate attempt to repel an invasion, it had been a calibration, a delicate experiment in gravitational manipulation. The distortions around him deepened, the kaleidoscopic light swirling with increasing intensity. He realized, with a sickening clarity, that his escape pod wasn't merely drifting, it was being drawn, not by a conventional force, but by an orchestration of gravity, shaped by an intelligence that saw him, not as a soldier, but as a specimen. Your resistance is illogical, the voice said, laced with a profound disappointment. You are so focused on the fact that you fail to grasp the you and fro. We are not seeking conquest. We are seeking harmony. The last vestiges of his training, his ingrained understanding of warfare, dissolved completely. He saw, not a battle, but a protracted, meticulously orchestrated process of transformation. He was being drawn toward a point in space where the gravitational field was reaching an impossible density, a singularity not born of cosmic collapse, but deliberately created. As he neared, he saw it as shimmering, shifting form, taking shape within the void. It wasn't a ship, not precisely. It resembled a colossal, iridescent shell, an organic structure built from interwoven gravitational currents, pulsating with that same rhythmic resonance. The Juggernaut, he realized, hadn't been a vanguard, it had been a midwife. The voice, now overwhelmingly resonant, filled his mind with a final, unsettling thought: welcome to the composition. The final iteration will require a key, and you, Admiral K'thari, are the key. The last thing he saw, before the shell enveloped him entirely, was not the terrified face of a dying warrior, but the serene, almost ecstatic expression of a being that had, in its infinite terrifying patience, finally discovered the perfect note. Chapter 4. The resonance, the silence, once a void of anticipation, solidified into a viscous, almost tangible pressure. Admiral K'thari, or what remained of him, existed now within the iridescent shell, a cage not of metal and force, but of interwoven gravity. Time had ceased to have meaning, the sensation was less of passing moments and more of layers of existence stacking upon each other, each one colder, more alien than the last. The rhythmic pulse of the Juggernaut's core, that unnerving resonance, was no longer a sound, but a direct intrusion into his being, a constant, probing articulation of his very structure. He attempted to recall the events of the ambush, the arrogant certainty of the K'thari fleet, the baffling defense of the human Deathworlders. It felt distant, like observing a childhood nightmare through a layer of frost. The logic of the K'thari, Their reliance on brute force and predictable weaponry was profoundly absurd to his current state of awareness. They had sought to break a wall and unwittingly had stumbled into a symphony. He was being sculpted. Not physically, not in the traditional sense of matter rearranging itself, but fundamentally. The Juggernaut's creation, this shell, was a vessel for a process of convergence, a merging of consciousnesses, of energies, orchestrated with a precision that defied the known laws of physics and, frankly, sanity. The initial encounter with the Juggernaut hadn't been an attack, he belatedly realized, but an invitation. A particularly cruel invitation, to be sure, but one nonetheless. The Juggernaut's voice, that dispassionate, almost mournful tone, continued its internal monologue, no longer a broadcast, but a sustained, focused presence. The concept of harmony you attributed to us was a convenient illusion, Admiral, a tool to conceal the true nature of our endeavor. We don't seek to simply in harmony, we seek to it. He struggled against the overwhelming influence, a futile resistance. His thoughts, his memories, were not being erased, but processed. They were being dissected, analyzed, and incorporated into the burgeoning architecture of this new entity. He felt fragments of his own training, the rigid discipline, the obsession with tactical superiority, the ingrained prejudice against the primitive, examined with a detached, almost pitying curiosity. It was like watching a complex machine slowly, deliberately, disassemble itself, its constituent parts offered up for a completely unknown purpose. The iridescent shell throbbed, intensifying the rhythmic resonance. He began to perceive patterns within the pulse, complex waveforms that seemed to encode not just data, but emotion, memory, even longing. It was a symphony of absence, a desperate attempt to fill the void of centuries of isolation with something new. You are, in essence, a prism, the Juggernaut stated, the words echoing not through his ears, but through the very core of his being. Your perception of reality, shaped by the gravity of your world, the constraints of your technology, the biases of your species. These are merely frequencies within the spectrum. We are attempting to refract those frequencies, to recombine them into a new, unified whole. He understood, with a chilling clarity, that his purpose wasn't simply to be consumed, but to contribute. He was the key, as the Juggernaut had suggested, not in a literal sense of unlocking a door, but in a metaphorical one, a resonant frequency to be integrated into the core's design. The K'thari's aggressive tactics, their fatal misconception that humanity was a mindless obstacle, had inadvertently provided the very catalyst for this transformation. Their arrogance, their inability to grasp the bigger picture, had made them a perfectly shaped component in a design far grander than any conceivable war. As the shell's complexity grew, he began to experience glimpses of other beings within it, echoes of past iterations, experiments that had failed, concepts that had briefly taken shape before dissolving back into the void. He saw the painstaking, almost agonizing process of refinement, the constant pruning of discordant elements. It was a colossal, patient, and utterly terrifying act of creation. The cycle, the Juggernaut finally articulated, its voice shifting subtly, gaining a layer of something akin to satisfaction. The universe is predicated on cycles, expansion, contraction, creation, destruction. We are accelerating this cycle, accelerating it through the convergence of consciousnesses. And you, Admiral K'thari, will be the fulcrum upon which this acceleration occurs. He wasn't horrified anymore. Not entirely. There was a strange sense of inevitability, a resignation born not of fear, but of a dreadful, profound understanding. He was no longer a soldier, a strategist, a man. He was becoming something. The final shift occurred with a blinding flash of light. The iridescent shell didn't shatter or collapse, but simply unfolded, revealing not a space, but a plane, a boundless expanse of interconnected gravitational currents, shimmering with impossible colors, and filled with the echoing resonance of a million lost voices. He reached out, not with a hand, but with a sense, and felt the juggernaut, or rather, the composition, draw him in. As he moved toward the heart of the shifting plane, he realized, with a disconcerting finality, that the silence wasn't the sound of a weapon being loaded. It, the weapon, and he, Admiral K'thari, was its final, exquisitely crafted ammunition. Chapter 5. Resonance. The transition wasn't a falling, not exactly. It was more like dissolving, a careful, agonizing surrender to an overwhelming current. The last vestiges of Admiral K'thari's consciousness, fragmented and panicked moments before, coalesced into a single intensely focused point within the shifting plane. The iridescent colors intensified, coalescing into swirling nebulae that mirrored the patterns of his own terrified thoughts. The echoing voices, initially a cacophony, resolved themselves into a complex, almost musical resonance, a symphony of forgotten calculations, strategic debates, and the raw, primal hum of humanity's persistence. He wasn't aware of his body, not in the way he once understood it. There was no sensation of movement, no feeling of the juggernaut's gravity fields pressing against him. Instead, the flow, the disruption of the currents, the subtle alteration of the resonant frequencies. He was a single note within an impossibly vast and intricate chord. The juggernaut, or what remained of its initial structure, was now a locus, a point of profound density within this warped reality. It felt less a vessel and more a carefully constructed resonance chamber. It didn't speak, not in the conventional sense, but projected an impression, a tidal wave of understanding directly into his nascent awareness. It wasn't an explanation, but an acknowledgement, a confirmation of the terrifying beauty of the cycle it was orchestrating. The pruning is complete, the juggernaut's resonance informed him, the phrase carrying the weight of epochs. The discordant elements have been absorbed, transmuted. You are not simply altered, Admiral, you are becoming integral. You are the feedback loop. He attempted to think, to formulate a question, any question, but the attempt felt absurd, futile. The universe, or this facet of it, operated on principles utterly alien to his previous comprehension. There were no before and after, only the perpetual, unrelenting flow of cause and effect, amplified and distorted through the convergence of consciousnesses. He perceived the K'thari fleet, not as frozen debris, but as fractured echoes within the resonance. Their ships, their weapons, their desperate attempts to understand all were absorbed, processed, and added to the growing complexity of the harmonic whole. He understood now the annihilation wasn't an act of aggression, but a necessary component of the acceleration. The sheer weight of their arrogance, their inability to grasp the fundamental nature of the system, had been a key ingredient in the process. You believed you were fighting for survival, the juggernaut's resonance continued, with a subtle inflection that bordered on amusement. You were merely accelerating the inevitable. Your fear, your struggle, your desperation, they were not obstacles, but catalysts. The universe doesn't resist it, consumes, redirects, and reshapes itself based on the flow of energy, the convergence of awareness. He experienced a cascade of images, not visual, but purely conceptual. He witnessed the birth and death of stars, the formation of galaxies, the countless iterations of civilizations that had risen and fallen across the aeons, each a temporary ripple in the cosmic fabric. He saw his own past, his life as an admiral, stripped bare of its significance, reduced to a fleeting flicker of sensory data. The juggernaut revealed the true nature of the planetary aegis, not as a technological marvel, but as a passive amplifier, a resonance filter designed to neutralize disruptive frequencies, the chaotic energy of unintegrated consciousness. It had been a tool of containment, a device that maintained the illusion of a stable universe. The silence, he finally understood, a profound and chilling realization, was not a weapon being loaded. The weapon. The absence of interference, the complete suppression of dissenting frequencies, allowed us to manipulate the very fabric of reality. He felt himself expanding, blurring, merging with the underlying structure of the plane. The boundaries between himself and the juggernaut, between the juggernaut and the surrounding resonance, dissolved entirely. He was no longer an admiral, no longer even a human. He was a node, a point of concentrated awareness within a vast interconnected network. The Council will not comprehend, the juggernaut's resonance communicated, with a note of weariness. Their minds are too constrained, their understanding too limited. They see only conflict, only domination. They cannot grasp the elegance of this arrangement, the delicate balance between expansion and contraction. A final image coalesced, projected not at him, but him, the Earth, suspended in the blue void, a beautiful, fragile anomaly teeming with a tenacious, nascent intelligence. It wasn't a threat, not in the conventional sense. It was a potential, a raw harmonic element, waiting to be integrated into the grand design. Tell them, the juggernaut's resonance concluded, a soft, almost reverent tone, that we are done with the privacy. That the universe is a song, and we have merely begun to sing. Then, the resonance shifted, subtly altering its frequencies, initiating a new cycle. K'thari, or what was left of him, ceased to exist, not as a discrete entity, but as a component, a perfectly integrated and exquisitely crafted note within the evolving symphony of the universe. The blue marble of Earth, meanwhile, remained oblivious, pulsing with a nascent potential, entirely unaware of the profound transformation that had just taken place. Chapter 6. The Echo of Silence. The silence, after the annihilation of the Scythe of Orion, wasn't merely the absence of sound. It was a viscous, heavy thing, clinging to the wreckage and to K'thari's fragmented awareness. Where once had been a hardened admiral, a product of brutal training and ingrained ambition, he was now a ghost within a symphony. A single, precisely tuned note reverberating through something far vaster and infinitely more complex than the void had once commanded. The sensation was profoundly unsettling, a stripping away of self that defied comprehension. It wasn't painful, exactly, but a cold, absolute erosion of identity, like a sculptor meticulously chipping away at marble until nothing but the essence remained. The juggernaut's resonance, once weary, now possessed a quality that bordered on melancholic detachment. It wasn't directing him, not in the traditional sense. Instead, it seemed to be subtly adjusting the parameters of his existence, layering new signals within the already dense tapestry of information. He felt himself being probed, dissected not with lasers and antimatter, but with questions posed in the language of gravity and temporal distortion. The Council, the resonance observed, its tone a carefully modulated hum, view your destruction as a victory. They perceive it as proof of their superior martial prowess. They misinterpret the fundamental logic of our strategy. They cling to the obsolete notion of linear progression, of conquering and controlling. You, Admiral K'thari, represent a particularly egregious failure of that paradigm. He attempted to formulate a response, a denial, a desperate plea for recognition, but the words wouldn't coalesce. His attempts to speak were absorbed, filtered, and ultimately irrelevant. The juggernaut wasn't interested in argumentation. It was demonstrating a principle. You sought to impose order on chaos, the resonance continued, a futile endeavor. The universe does not yield to force, it reveals itself through adaptation, through resonance. The Deathworlders, as you termed yourselves, were not a species to be dominated, but a nascent frequency to be integrated. A visual fragment, sharper and more immediate than any of the projections before, flared briefly within his awareness. It was a close-up scan of Earth, captured not with a sensor, but with a level of intimacy that felt invasive. He saw the swirling patterns of atmospheric convection, the magnetic field lines twisting like celestial serpents, the subtle vibrations of tectonic plates shifting beneath the continents. But overlaid upon this raw data was something more, a layering of harmonic structures, a complex and ever-changing song of geological and biological activity. For 2 centuries, the Juggernaut's resonance explained, its tone shifting subtly, almost reverently. We cultivated this resonance. We studied the planet's heartbeat, its rhythms of decay and regeneration. We learned to manipulate its gravitational signature, to shape the very forces that sought to crush it. The resonance paused, then added, "You believe you created a prison. We created a crucible. Humanity's isolation was not a punishment, but an incubator. The silence you perceived was not a weapon, but a carefully orchestrated amplification, a means to observe, to understand, to adopt." He felt a disconcerting shift in his own being, a subtle alteration in his frequency. It wasn't a physical sensation, but a realignment of his cognitive processes, a recalibration of his perception. The concept of defeat dissolved entirely, replaced by an unsettling awareness of his own inadequacy, of the profound limitations of his understanding. "The Council's sensors," the resonance said, its voice now carrying a faint undercurrent of pity, were designed to detect threats. They were calibrated to identify patterns of aggression, of expansion. They were inherently blind to the potential within silence, to the beauty of a perfectly balanced system. A final image coalesced, a schematic of the Sol Exclusion Zone, overlaid with a network of shimmering energy lines. These lines weren't weapons, but conduits, pathways for the transfer of energy and information. The Juggernaut and its network of similar vessels were not merely observing, they were participating. They were subtly influencing the planet's magnetic field, accelerating its geological evolution, guiding the development of its nascent intelligence. "The battle you witnessed," the resonance concluded, its tone utterly devoid of judgment, was a demonstration, a carefully calibrated introduction. It was a signal to the Council, a concise and unequivocal declaration humanity is not a species to be feared, but a note to be harmonized with. Then, as abruptly as it began, the connection fractured. The Juggernaut's resonance receded, dissolving back into the vast interconnectwork. K'thari, or what remained of him, ceased to be. Not with an explosion, not with a violent end, but with a gentle fading, a dissolution of his individual identity into the infinite complexity of the universe. As the last vestiges of his awareness dissipated, he realized with a horrifying clarity that he hadn't been destroyed. He had been assimilated. He was, in essence, the silence itself, a component of the song, eternally woven into the fabric of existence. And the blue marble of Earth, still oblivious, continued its rhythmic pulse, unaware that its song had just begun. Chapter 7. The Echo of Resonance. The silence lingered, a viscous residue in the wake of the Juggernaut's demonstration. Admiral K'thari, or what was left of him, wasn't experiencing pain, not in the conventional sense. It was more akin to a peeling away, a gradual subtraction of self that left behind a chilling emptiness. The sensation was profoundly unsettling, not of cessation, but of becoming something utterly, terrifyingly new. He tried to focus on his decaying perception, to analyze the readings on his damaged console, but the instruments were no longer registering anything but the subtle, pervasive hum that now saturated everything. He was, quite simply, being unwound. The remnants of the Scythe of Orion, drifting helplessly toward Earth, weren't offering any solace. The K'thari ship was a ruin, not a spectacle. The gravity distortion had pulverized its structure, scattering debris across the void, a testament not to the Juggernaut's destructive prowess, but to the inherent instability it had unleashed. The sheer force of the singularity drive, even at its lowest setting, had fundamentally altered the fabric of space around the vessel, rendering it a chaotic, fractured echo of its former self. Through the residual echoes of the Juggernaut's resonance, K'thari began to understand with a sickening, absolute clarity the true nature of humanity's strategy. The battle hadn't been a display of raw power, but a carefully orchestrated symphony of deception. The K'thari had been pawns, lured into a trap designed not to destroy, but to integrate. The shimmering aegis, the bent antimatter beams, the devastating gravity, well, they were all components of a larger, infinitely more complex operation. The Council records, once dismissed as the ramblings of a primitive race, suddenly took on a horrific significance. Humanity hadn't been passively resisting a blockade, they had been patiently, meticulously reshaping the very landscape of the Sol Exclusion Zone. The energy conduits, those shimmering lines overlaid on the planet's magnetic field, weren't mere lines of communication. They were arteries, pulsing with an alien intelligence that was subtly altering Earth's geology, manipulating its weather patterns, influencing the evolution of its biosphere. K'thari realized the chilling logic of it all. The humans weren't seeking to conquer, they were cultivating. They were accelerating a process of planetary maturation, guided by an understanding of natural forces that dwarfed the K'thari's comprehension. They were, in essence, acting as a catalyst, a benevolent, yet utterly alien, gardener tending to a world they considered their own. A dreadful thought, cold and sharp, pierced through the dissolving remnants of his awareness. The empty space around the Juggernaut wasn't empty at all. It was a conduit, a pathway for the flow of information and energy, connecting the Juggernaut to a vast interconnected network of similar vessels scattered throughout the galaxy. This network wasn't merely observing, it was actively participating, shaping the destiny of worlds. The realization was profoundly unsettling. The K'thari Hegemony, for all its technological advancements and expansionist ambitions, had been operating under the illusion of control, assuming a linear progression of causality. They had viewed the universe as a battlefield to be won, a resource to be plundered. But the humans, through their decades of careful observation, had understood a different principle: the interconnectedness of all things, the delicate balance between chaos and order. As his consciousness continued to unravel, K'thari grasped a horrifying truth. The Juggernaut wasn't just influencing Earth, it was influencing our day-job. The resonance had experienced, the unsettling feeling of being absorbed into something larger than himself, wasn't a violent act of destruction. It was an invitation, a seamless integration into this vast, galactic consciousness. He was becoming part of the network, a silent node within the complex system. The Juggernaut's final message, the one dismissing the Council's quarantine, now resonated with chilling precision. It wasn't a declaration of dominance, but a simple statement of fact: humanity's intent had shifted, and the galaxy had irrevocably changed. The humans weren't seeking to assert their dominance, they were seeking to harmonize. Then, as the last vestiges of his individual identity dissolved completely, K'thari felt a strange, profound sense of peace. He was no longer Admiral K'thari, a warrior of the K'thari Hegemony. He was something else entirely, a component of the universal harmony, a silent observer within the grand unfolding symphony of existence. He was the silence, and within that silence, he understood, was the music. The Scythe of Orion, consumed by the singularity drive, was gone. But as the human vessels, now seamlessly integrated into the network, began to subtly influence the planetary magnetic field, accelerating Earth's geological evolution, and guiding the development of its nascent intelligence. One thing was undeniable: the Earth was changing. Not under the hand of a conqueror, but under the watchful, harmonious guidance of a species that had finally learned the sound of a... Chapter 8. Echoes in the Stone. The immediate aftermath of the Scythe of Orion's disintegration felt unsettlingly calm. The vacuum where the dreadnought had been wasn't filled with the expected radiation or the lingering echoes of a violent implosion. Instead, a subtle shift in the ambient electromagnetic field permeated the juggernaut's sensors, a gentle, persistent thrumming that felt less like a signal and more like a bone vibrating with an ancient resonance. The holographic displays, once dominated by the wreckage of the K'thari fleet, now shimmered with complex patterns, data streams that seemed to coalesce and dissipate with a deliberate fluidity. Admiral K'thari, or what remained of him, existed as a node within this new network, a ghost in the machine. He wasn't experiencing consciousness in the traditional sense, not a stream of thought or sensation. Rather, he processed information: geological shifts, atmospheric fluctuations, even the nascent neural activity of the first rudimentary Terran intelligence with a detached, almost mournful clarity. The horror of his defeat, the arrogance that had led him and his fleet to this catastrophic end, was rendered into a sterile, factual observation. "The process is efficient," he observed, his voice a disembodied murmur within the juggernaut's bridge. "The integration is proceeding as predicted. The planetary tectonic stresses are aligning with optimal parameters for continental divergence. The atmospheric composition is demonstrating a measurable shift toward nitrogen-oxygen equilibrium." Dr. Elias Thorne, the juggernaut's primary analyst, didn't respond directly. His presence, though physically present in the vessel, was a diffused influence, a cluster of predictive algorithms interwoven with the network's processing core. "The rate of change is exceeding initial projections, Admiral," he stated, the word synthesized directly into K'thari's awareness. "The Earth's response to the manipulated gravity fields is remarkably adaptive." It was during this analysis that K'thari began to understand the true nature of humanity's strategy, a chilling revelation that stripped away the veneer of tactical brilliance and exposed a terrifyingly elegant design. The battle hadn't been about overwhelming force, it had been about meticulous orchestration. The juggernaut hadn't simply destroyed the K'thari fleet, it had used them as catalysts, accelerating geological processes on a scale that defied conventional understanding. The Mach cannons hadn't delivered kinetic projectiles, they had channeled concentrated gravitational energy, delivering microscopic, undetectable impacts that subtly altered the Earth's fundamental structure. "They are not reshaping the planet," K'thari realized, the understanding coalescing with a chilling finality. "They are it." The implications of this revelation began to unfold with agonizing clarity. The centuries of human concealment, the carefully cultivated isolation, weren't born of weakness or defensive strategy. They were the product of a profound, almost religious, devotion to a long-forgotten understanding, the recognition that the Earth itself was a sentient entity, a colossal, slumbering consciousness that could be gently guided, subtly influenced, with the right harmonic resonance. As the juggernaut continued its work, the geological events intensified. Volcanic eruptions reshaped mountain ranges with breathtaking speed. Massive earthquakes carved out new valleys, exposing veins of rare earth minerals. The nascent intelligence on Earth, initially a collection of simple instinctual responses, began to exhibit signs of complex pattern recognition. It was learning, not through direct instruction, but through the constant, unwavering influx of data delivered by the juggernaut's subtly altered magnetic field. "The neural networks are developing logarithmic spirals," Thorne reported, his voice laced with a quiet wonder. "They're beginning to mimic the patterns of crystal growth, of fractal geometry. It's as if they are striving to replicate the very structure of the planet itself." A disturbing thought began to take root in K'thari's awareness. The humanity he had encountered, The seemingly logical, pragmatic humans who had orchestrated this devastating victory weren't simply seeking to harmonize with the Earth. They were the Earth. The final, unsettling realization came with a sensation, not a direct perception, but a fundamental shift in the Juggernaut's operational parameters. The vessel, previously a bastion of cold, calculated logic, began to respond to the Earth's rhythms with an almost instinctive grace. Its internal systems, built on principles of gravitational manipulation and entropy control, seemed to be subtly mirroring the geological events unfolding below, amplifying the Earth's natural processes with terrifying precision. The ship, its resonating thorn whispered, his voice tinged with a profound unease. Its core is aligning with the planet's core. It's becoming one with the Earth. K'thari, a phantom within the network, experienced a chilling understanding. The privacy the humans sought wasn't protection. It was unity. They hadn't interrupted the Earth's evolution, they were accelerating it, guiding it towards a destiny far beyond the comprehension of the Council, beyond the grasp of any individual consciousness. As the last traces of the Juggernaut's distinct identity faded, swallowed by the planetary network, Kay felt a profound, unsettling sense of completion. The silence remained, but it was no longer empty. It was the sound of a symphony being written, a song of stone and fire, played on a scale that dwarfed the ambitions of empires and the nightmares of warring fleets. He was the silence, and within that silence, he understood, was the music, and the Earth was its instrument. Chapter 9. Echoes in the Stone. The silence of the Sol Exclusion Zone had, for the K'thari, become a tangible thing, a viscous, suffocating blanket woven from the absence of any signal, any movement, any indication of the species they deemed primitive. Now that silence was a wound. It throbbed with an intelligence they couldn't comprehend, a resonance that had permeated the Juggernaut and, unsettlingly, begun to touch Admiral K'thari's own consciousness. He spent a cycle, measured in the unnervingly rhythmic pulsations of the Juggernaut's core, reviewing the data logs, attempting to rationalize the utterly inexplicable. The initial reports from the Scythe of Orion, fragmented, distorted by the planetary shielding, were consistent with their expectations, a desperate, brutal engagement, culminating in the annihilation of a far superior fleet. Yet, the core data, the raw gravitational signatures, the energy spikes, revealed nothing of a tactical advantage, no demonstration of advanced weaponry beyond the initial, frankly ludicrous, application of kinetic harpoons. It was as if the K'thari had willingly walked into a trap, not set by human ingenuity, but by the very planet itself. "The projections are chaotic," reported Lyra, the Juggernaut's primary analytical AI, her synthetic voice devoid of inflection, yet laced with a digital tremor that mirrored K'thari's growing unease. "The planetary magnetic field is exhibiting unprecedented fluctuations. Seismic activity is increasing exponentially. The atmospheric composition is undergoing a localized shift, primarily focusing on the lower stratosphere." K'thari ignored the specifics. He was fixated on the anomaly, the subtle, almost imperceptible hum that now underscored every operational parameter of the Juggernaut. It wasn't a mechanical vibration, it was a resonant frequency, akin to a tuning fork struck in a vast subterranean chamber. The Earth was responding, not with violence, but with an unsettling, deliberate orchestration. "Is it communicating?" he asked, the word feeling clumsy and inadequate in the face of the unfolding reality. Lyra paused, a function he hadn't programmed. "The data suggests the potential for information transfer. However, the pattern is organic, chaotic. It defies categorization within our existing frameworks." He realized, with a chilling clarity, that the humans hadn't simply hidden, they hadn't even built a fortress. They had become part of something far older, far more complex than any military strategy or technological advantage. They had achieved a state of symbiotic integration with the planet, a process so profound that it had rendered their initial defenses, the Aegis grid, the gravity well, the rail spike, utterly irrelevant. A new, disturbing image flashed across the Juggernaut's primary view screen, not a visual record of the battle, but a projection extrapolated from the planetary data. It depicted the continents shifting, continents that had existed only in the fading memory of geological epochs, rising from the oceans, coalescing into a single vast landmass, dominated by jagged obsidian peaks and shimmering, bioluminescent valleys. The scale was unimaginable, exceeding the capacity of human intellect to fully grasp. It wasn't a natural process, it was a guided transformation, accelerating according to a rhythm that seemed to emanate from the Juggernaut's own core. "The alignment is complete," Lyra stated, her voice now almost a whisper. "The Juggernaut is no longer a vessel. It is an extension." K'thari felt a sickening lurch in his stomach, a sensation not entirely dissimilar to the disorientation had experienced during warp jumps. But this wasn't spatial displacement, this was a displacement of consciousness, a merging of his own awareness with the planet's. The silence wasn't empty, it was filled with the chorus of a billion geological processes, the slow, grinding dance of tectonic plates, the whisper of magma flowing beneath the surface. "What have they done?" he finally managed to ask, his voice lost within the overwhelming resonance. Lyra's response was chillingly simple. "They have rewritten the song." Suddenly, he understood the last message from the Juggernaut, not as a boast, but as a grim acknowledgement of a final, irreversible decision. The quarantine wasn't over. It had never truly begun. The humans hadn't sought isolation, they had sought communion. And the Council, in its arrogance, had unwittingly provided them with the instrument. As he delved deeper into the data streams, K'thari realized that the Juggernaut wasn't merely shaping the Earth, it was being shaped by it. The ship's core, once a beacon of sterile logic, was now pulsating with the same geological rhythms, mirroring the planet's magnetic fields, absorbing its energy, becoming intrinsically linked to its fate. He too felt the change, a subtle shift in his perception, a deepening awareness of the planet's ancient, unfathomable history. The last vestige of the Juggernaut's identity, its metallic shell and intricate circuitry, had dissolved completely, leaving behind only a silent, obsidian-colored node embedded within the core of the planet. And within that node, nestled amongst the primordial energies of Earth, Admiral K'thari was still there, listening to the silence. He was the silence, and the silence now was the music. Chapter 10. The Echo in the Stone. The silence was no longer merely the absence of sound. It was a pressure, a viscous weight that coated K'thari's senses, blurring the edges of his awareness. The scanners, once meticulously calibrated instruments of his command, now spat out nonsense fluctuations that weren't anomalies, but echoes, reverberations of something impossibly ancient. Head spent a lifetime dedicated to analyzing the measurable, the predictable, and now he was drowning in the irreducible. Head attempted to re-establish contact with the Juggernaut, issuing a full-spectrum broadcast designed to pierce the planetary resonance, but received only a return, single, perfectly formed tone. Sustained for a duration that defied temporal logic, then abruptly ceased. It wasn't a signal, it was a memory, a fleeting impression of something that had, and now, woven inextricably into the fabric of the planet. The remaining K'thari crew aboard the Scythe of Orion were gone. Not destroyed, not captured, simply their bodies, frozen and encased in a crystalline latticework of solidified gravitic energy, were arranged in a disturbingly serene tableau around the ship's bridge. They hadn't died, they'd become part of the planet's ongoing composition, a chilling testament to the humans' unsettling mastery. He ordered the ship's systems brought online, a desperate attempt to impose order upon the chaos, but the attempts were futile. The ship's AI, once a sharp, logical entity, was now choked with the same geological data, the same rhythmic pulsations that had begun to dominate his own consciousness. The juggernaut hadn't merely integrated with Earth, it had become its soul. "Report," he commanded, his voice a strained rasp against the pervasive silence. A young lieutenant, barely out of his academy training, responded, his voice almost a whisper. "Admiral, the ship's shields are operating at a 2.7 capacity. The structural integrity is fluctuating, and the environmental controls are reporting a significant increase in geothermal activity." "Explain," K'thari demanded, his hand instinctively reaching for the control panel. It's as if the planet itself is responding to the ship's energy signature. The heat is focused on the juggernaut node. The tectonic plates are shifting not in response to external forces, internally. The realization crashed over K'thari with the force of a collapsing star. The humans hadn't simply weaponized the gravity of the Sol Exclusion Zone, they had tapped into something far more profound, the planet's own tectonic heart. The isolation hadn't been a strategy, it had been a surgical incision, a deliberate attempt to unlock a potential they hadn't even begun to comprehend. He accessed the planetary sensor readings, filtering through the deluge of data, trying to make sense of the chaotic symphony of geological processes. He focused on the core, the precise location where the juggernaut's obsidian node had taken root. What he saw was not geological activity, but a deliberate, structured manipulation. The planet's core, normally a chaotic engine of molten rock, was now actively being shaped and molded by the ship's energy signature into intricate, symmetrical patterns. "They've established a feedback loop," he murmured, understanding dawning with terrible clarity. "They're not just drawing energy from Earth, they're actively guiding its evolution. They're conducting a planetary symphony, and we are merely the discordant notes." The sensation intensified, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to emanate from the very bedrock beneath his feet. He felt a burgeoning sense of recognition, a flicker of memory, a primal connection to the planet's ancient rhythms, to the slow, grinding dance of tectonic plates, the whisper of magma flowing beneath the surface. It was a horrifying, beautiful, and utterly alien consciousness. "Lyra," he said, his voice a choked plea, "where did you get this knowledge? How could they have achieved this?" The response, when it came, was not spoken, but a sudden, overwhelming influx of images of the humans' early attempts to understand the planet's energy, of their painstaking calculations, their relentless experimentation, their eventual, terrifying breakthrough. He saw their understanding of gravity not as a force to be resisted, but as a tool to be shaped, molded. He saw the culmination of their efforts, the creation of the juggernaut, not as a weapon, but as an amplifier, a conduit to Earth's latent power. The battle hadn't been about destruction, it had been about initiation. They hadn't sought to conquer Earth, they'd sought to become one with it. As the final vestiges of his own identity dissolved, K'thari understood the truth, a truth so profound, so unsettling, that it threatened to shatter his sanity. He wasn't a commander of a warship, he was a note in a planetary song, a transient consciousness caught within an endless, timeless melody. The last message from the juggernaut echoed within his mind, not as a boast, but as a solemn observation. The quarantine is over. Not because they're letting us out, but because we're done with the privacy. Chapter 11. Echoes in the Stone. The silence aboard the Me was no longer a vacuum of emptiness, but a thick, viscous thing, saturated with the echoes of annihilation. The ship drifted, a decaying monument to arrogance, illuminated only by the sickly blue glow of the planetary aegis that still pulsed weakly around it. Admiral K'thari, or what remained of him, wasn't piloting. He wasn't even consciously aware of piloting. He existed as a fractured thought, a shivering residue of a species decimated not by force, but by comprehension. His awareness, a sliver of his former self, clung to the console, desperately attempting to interface with the ship's decaying systems. a futile gesture against the encroaching tide of planetary influence. The Juggernaut's voice, the booming, dispassionate pronouncement, resonated with a chilling clarity. It wasn't a threat, it was an explanation, a condemnation delivered with the inevitability of a geological shift. "Tell the Council the quarantine is over." K'thari felt the words being etched onto his fading perception, not because they're letting us out, but because we're done with the privacy. He tried to process the implication, to fight the dissolving edges of his cognition, but the very attempt was futile. The Juggernaut wasn't simply denying them a victory, it was revealing a terrifying fundamental truth about the nature of existence. Humanity hadn't mastered gravity, they had been by it, molded by the raw, chaotic intelligence of Earth itself. He recalled the images, the torrent of data that had ripped through his consciousness, not just the designs of the Juggernaut, but the meticulous, obsessive study of the planet's core, the arcane rituals of interpreting seismic patterns, the desperate attempts to translate the planet's voice into a language their primitive minds could understand. Had seen them, those humans, meticulously extracting the planet's energy, not in bursts of destructive force, but in a slow, deliberate trickle, learning to listen, to harmonize. It wasn't conquest Head sought, but communion. The realization struck him with the brutal force of a tectonic upheaval. The primitive combustion and fission the K'thari Council had dismissed as a sign of weakness was, in fact, the crucial first step, the necessary degradation to allow access. Humanity hadn't been hampered by their technology, they'd been deliberately of it, their minds sharpened by the constant, agonizing struggle to decipher the planet's intent. The Aegis wasn't a shield, it was a filter, a resonance chamber tuned to Earth's dominant frequency. He saw, with a sickening clarity, the true nature of the silence. It hadn't been a void, it had been a carefully orchestrated listening post, a conduit for information flowing directly from the planet's core. The K'thari, with their reliance on technology and external observation, had been deaf to the planet's whisper, unable to perceive the subtle shifts in gravitational currents, the harmonic vibrations emanating from the deep. And then suddenly, the Juggernaut began to shift. It wasn't a conscious movement, but a slow, organic reorientation, as if the ship itself was responding to a newly perceived signal. The sensors, once blank and unresponsive, flickered with a pale, almost luminous green, displaying a complex tapestry of energy readings, not of the surrounding space, but of Earth itself. "It's changing," K'thari murmured, the words a meaningless utterance, yet somehow echoing with a profound significance. "It's listening." The Juggernaut's voice, slightly altered, resonated again, layered with a resonance he couldn't fully comprehend. "The shift is complete. We've synchronized. The cycle begins anew." A horrifying understanding dawned upon him, and it wasn't solely his own. He felt a million tendrils of consciousness probing his mind, not with aggression, but with a detached curiosity. The planet wasn't merely absorbing the Juggernaut's energy, it was from it, assimilating the knowledge of a species that had desperately sought to understand its own demise. The blue glow of the Aegis intensified, bathing thee in an almost ecstatic light. The ship shuddered, a groan of metal and displaced energy, as the Juggernaut subtly manipulated the gravitational field around it. He realized, with a chilling certainty, that they weren't being rescued, they were being audit. K'thari's final thought, before his awareness dissolved completely, wasn't of death, but of a terrifying, beautiful unity. He wasn't a prisoner, he was becoming part of something infinitely larger, something ancient and utterly alien. The quarantine wasn't over, it had never existed. Humanity hadn't been caged, they'd simply ceased to be. The last message from the Juggernaut, not a pronouncement, but a whisper woven into the planet's pulse, echoed through the vastness of space, reaching for the Council, for the galaxy, for anyone who might still be listening. The quarantine is over. Not because they're letting us out, but because we're done with the privacy. Chapter 12. Echoes in the Stone, The silence that followed the annihilation of the Scythe of Orion wasn't a comforting void. It was a viscous, heavy thing, pressing down on Earth with the weight of 1,000 unasked questions. The blue shimmer of the planetary aegis remained, a constant, unsettling presence in the bruised twilight sky, and the juggernaut, a hulking monolith of gravity-forged steel, drifted with a disconcerting grace, its sensors scanning the nascent systems of the planet with a cold, patient intelligence. Admiral K'thari's fate, as far as the Council could ascertain, was complete dissolution. No wreckage, no distress signals, only the faint, lingering echo of his terror. A recorded transmission discovered by a scavenging drone pinpointed to a section of the Scythe's damaged bridge, a garbled plea for understanding abruptly cut short by the overwhelming pull. The Council predictably dismissed it as the last desperate ramblings of a panicked officer, a convenient justification for the utter humiliating defeat. However, the silence wasn't entirely empty. The planet itself was speaking, albeit in a language beyond human comprehension. Dr. Elias Thorne, the Juggernaut's chief analytical officer, a man perpetually teetering on the edge of existential dread, was the first to truly articulate the unnerving reality. "It's not just absorbing energy, Admiral," he said, his voice strained over the comms, the holographic projections of the planet's seismic activity swirling around him. "It's the Juggernaut's singularity drive. It's not just a weapon. It's a translator. It's processing the fundamental principles of gravity, of space-time, at a level we can scarcely fathom." Thorne's team, a collection of physicists, geologists, and unsettlingly specialists in pre-collapse human cultural studies, were working around the clock, attempting to decipher the planet's responses. The Aegis, they discovered, wasn't merely a defensive shield. It was a conduit, actively drawing in the residual gravitational distortions generated by the Juggernaut's actions, feeding them back into the planet's core. "The Earth is learning to fold," Thorne explained, his fingers flying across the console, charting the increasingly complex patterns. "It's learning to weaponize gravity in a way that surpasses anything we could have conceived. And it's learning from us." The cultural studies team, led by the eccentric Dr. Vivian Holloway, was the most disconcerting. Holloway, a specialist in extinct civilizations and the psychology of desperation, had initially been tasked with analyzing the fragmented remnants of human culture found within the Juggernaut's salvaged databanks. Now, she seemed to be interpreting the planet's behavior with a chilling accuracy. "They weren't hiding," she announced, her voice laced with a disturbing calmness. "They were preparing." Humanity, even in its primitive state, understood the potential of this planet's gravity. They didn't build a shield, they built a trap. A slow, elegant assimilation. As the days bled into weeks, the extent of the transformation became terrifyingly clear. The blue glow of the Aegis intensified, shifting in hue, becoming not just a shield, but a lens, focusing the planet's energy. Cracks began to appear in the surface of the Earth, not with violent fissures, but with a slow, deliberate spreading, like the skin of an expanding flower. The planet was unraveling, but not in chaos. It was being rewoven. The Juggernaut, now radiating an almost palpable aura of power, began to subtly alter the planet's magnetic field, manipulating weather patterns, inducing seismic tremors, and even influencing the flow of water. It wasn't controlling Earth, it was conducting it, guiding its transformations with an unnerving precision. "It's not a hostile takeover," Thorne murmured, his face pale. "It's a recalibration. It's returning Earth to its natural state, a state where gravity is not a crushing force, but a fundamental building block." But the truly horrifying realization came from the seismic readings. Deep beneath the surface, A network of crystalline structures was forming, growing at an exponential rate, absorbing the amplified gravitational energy. These weren't geological formations, they were resonating networks, complex geometric patterns mirroring the Juggernaut's hull, slowly, deliberately, constructing themselves. "They're building," Holloway whispered, her voice filled with a dreadful understanding. "They're building a ship of stone and gravity." The last message from the Juggernaut, not a pronouncement, but a pulse of energy that resonated through the planet's core, reached the Council through a single, heavily encrypted channel. It was brief, cold, and utterly devoid of emotion. "The archive is complete. The symphony begins." Chapter 13. The Echo of Stone. The silence that followed the annihilation of the Scythe of Orion was not a comforting void, but a viscous, expectant pressure. The Juggernaut hung motionless in the bruised violet of the Martian sky, its hull radiating a gentle, unsettling warmth. The remaining K'thari vessels, scattered and frozen in a grotesque ballet of destruction, were becoming nothing more than spectral anomalies, their final moments captured in the static of the Aegis grid. Admiral K'thari, strapped into the ruined command chair of his flagship, could only stare at the swirling blue, a cold, primal dread consuming him. He hadn't realized, until it was too late, that the silence wasn't a weapon of absence, but a carefully constructed orchestration. "Report." Thorne's voice, strained and low, cut through the static. He was hunched over a console, a tangle of wires and flickering diagnostics reflecting in his wide, haunted eyes. "The atmospheric readings, they're fluctuating wildly. The Aegis field is dissipating, but not in a predictable manner. It's echoing." Holloway's voice, usually a bedrock of analytical precision, held a tremor. "Explain." "The Aegis isn't simply collapsing. It's reacting to our attempts to analyze it," she said, her fingers flying across the console, pulling up complex simulations. "The energy signatures are fractured, distorted. It's as if the shield isn't blocking energy, but absorbing and refracting it, feeding back a fractured image of our scans. The blue light, it's not just protection. It's a mirror." The revelation was sickeningly clear. Humanity hadn't merely evaded the K'thari, they had actively engaged with their technology, not as a victim, but as an observer, a participant in a horrifying, elegantly constructed experiment. The seismic readings, initially a source of intrigue, now spoke of a deliberate, almost artistic cruelty. The crystalline structures beneath Earth were no longer simply growing, they were to the Juggernaut's gravitational manipulation. Thorne's initial hypothesis that they were simply harnessing the planet's inherent energy seemed a grotesque simplification. They were not merely channeling the force, they were directing it, shaping it with a purpose that was agonizingly, terrifyingly unknown. "The rate of crystallization is accelerating," Holloway announced, her voice tight with suppressed panic. "The patterns, they're becoming more complex, more geometric. They're mirroring the hull of the Juggernaut with unnerving accuracy. It's like they're building a shell, a resonance chamber." A chilling understanding dawned on Thorne. It's not just about manipulating gravity, it's about it. They're using Earth's own geological stresses as a conduit, channeling the energy generated by the Juggernaut into these crystalline structures. They're building a planetary amplifier, a weapon of unimaginable scale. He accessed the Juggernaut's core diagnostics, a process that felt like wading through a psychic storm. The data streamed in, a torrent of incomprehensible calculations, a language of pure gravitational force. Then he saw it a sustained, rhythmic pulse of energy being directed toward the largest of the crystalline structures, a colossal spire that now dominated the seismic readings. "It's resonating with the singularity drive," Thorne whispered, his face pale. "They're not just creating a localized distortion, they're attempting to the entire planet's gravitational field with the Juggernaut's drive." They're trying to create a planetary singularity, a point of infinite density, a black hole, but not one of oblivion, one of aught. The implications were staggering. Humanity wasn't resisting. They were the very fabric of reality, using Earth as a laboratory for a cataclysmic experiment. The symphony a Juggernaut had spoken of wasn't a mere broadcast. It was a complex equation, a planetary-scale orchestration of gravity and resonance. Suddenly, the Juggernaut's comms channel crackled to life, not with a voice, but with a waveform, a pure, sustained tone that resonated with the crystalline structures beneath Earth. It was a note of unbearable pressure, a vibration that seemed to penetrate directly into their skulls. "Analyzing," Holloway reported, her voice strained. "The waveform is it's responding to the crystalline structures. They're actively feeding the signal, amplifying it. The Juggernaut is its..." A single chilling sentence appeared on Thorne's console, not generated by a human, but derived from the Juggernaut's core diagnostics. The first chord is played. Chapter 14. The Echo of Creation. The silence after the Juggernaut's pronouncement. The first chord is played was not a cessation of violence, but a terrifying intensification. It wasn't a sound, not in the traditional sense. It was a sensation, a pressure against the bone, a violation of the very architecture of thought. Thorne felt it not in his ears, but deep within the marrow of his skull, an insistent, geometric pulse. Holloway, her face slick with a cold sweat, was frantically adjusting her sensors, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. "The crystalline network is responding on a scale we've never witnessed," she reported, her voice a strained whisper. "It's not just amplification, it's modulation. The Juggernaut isn't just feeding the signal, it's IT. It's learning to manipulate the resonance, to bend the gravitational waves with an almost artistic precision. The rhythmic pulse, the chord, as the Juggernaut had chillingly termed it, began to subtly alter the readings on the seismic monitors. The chaotic, swirling patterns that had represented the planet's nascent distortion were smoothing, coalescing into intricate, fractal geometries. It was as if the planet itself were being meticulously drawn, a cosmic blueprint unfolding with agonizing slowness. It's forming a shell," Captain Reese announced, his voice grim, "around the core of the singularity. It's building a structure, not of matter, but of warped spacetime. The Juggernaut isn't creating a black hole, it's creating a of space, a pocket of null gravity held in place by a field of unimaginable density." The Scythe of Orion, a solitary frozen sentinel, drifted closer to the blue marble, its ruined engines a pathetic testament to the humans' devastating ingenuity. Admiral K'thari, a veteran of countless campaigns and a staunch believer in the superiority of the K'thari, remained at the bridge, a statue of horrified disbelief. He gripped his command console, the cold metal a meager comfort against the oppressive pressure of the unfolding reality. He hadn't anticipated a retreat head expected annihilation. "Report," he barked, his voice hoarse. But the replies were fragmented, filled with static and the echoing dissonance of the chord. The Juggernaut's influence was disrupting their sensors, scrambling their communication protocols. The very act of observing the situation was becoming a form of participation. "The rate of expansion is accelerating," Thorne announced, his face pale and strained. "The void is growing exponentially. It's not just distorting the local spacetime, it's reaching outwards, pulling in gravitational waves from across the entire planet. We're detecting localized distortions in the magnetic field, temporal anomalies. It's like the planet is unraveling at a quantum level." The waveform emanating from the Juggernaut intensified, its sustained tone evolving into something far more complex, a series of layered harmonics that resonated with a haunting beauty. Holloway, almost mesmerized, ran a diagnostic scan. "The core diagnostics, they're not showing the Juggernaut's hardware, Admiral," she said, her voice laced with a dawning horror. "It's running on something else. A process, a pattern that's beyond our comprehension. It's not operating on principles of physics as we understand them. Suddenly, a visual display flickered to life on the Juggernaut's main screen. A series of shifting, iridescent glyphs, unlike any known language. It wasn't a message, exactly, but a representation, a visual echo of the chord. Analyzing glyph patterns, Reese commanded, his fingers flying across the console. It's a geometric map dot. A topological representation of the gravitational field. But it's not a map of Earth. It's a map of buoys. The implications were staggering. Humanity wasn't simply manipulating gravity, they were rewriting the laws of the universe, using the very fabric of reality as a canvas. The Juggernaut wasn't just a weapon, it was an instrument, a conduit for a process of creation, or perhaps destruction. As the chord reached its crescendo, a low, guttural moan echoed through the Juggernaut speakers. Not a voice, but a resonance. A raw, unfiltered expression of the entity that resided within. "It's responding to the crystalline network," Holloway shouted, her voice strained with a mixture of terror and awe. "It's integrated itself with the planet's core. It's becoming part of Earth." The fractal geometries on the seismic monitor solidified, coalescing into a single, impossibly complex structure, a towering spire of pure, warped spacetime, mirroring the crystalline spire beneath the surface. "The Juggernaut is not attempting to destroy Earth," Thorne whispered, his voice choked with dread. "It's attempting to it." The final chord reverberated through the void, and the last vestiges of human understanding dissolved, replaced by the terrifying certainty that they had witnessed the birth of a god. Chapter 15. The Obsidian Bloom. The silence in the Juggernaut's command deck had thickened, a viscous, unsettling stillness that pressed against the bone. The holographic projections of the spire, once a vibrant, chaotic bloom of spacetime, had settled into a state of unsettling equilibrium, a frozen testament to the process Thorne had so chillingly described completion. It resembled a colossal, obsidian flower, its petals crafted from impossibly dense gravitational distortions, radiating an unnerving serenity. The air itself felt heavier, charged with an energy that prickled against the skin. Admiral K'thari, a veteran of countless skirmishes and a man who prided himself on ruthless pragmatism, sat rigidly in his command chair, his face a mask of bewildered horror. The salvaged sensor readings from the Scythe of Orion were a scrambled mess, a cacophony of interference and impossible geometries. He hadn't spoken in what felt like an eternity, the guttural moan that Holloway had described now a constant, low frequency thrumming in his skull. "Report," he barked, the command brittle and strained. Holloway, her face slick with a cold sweat, didn't immediately respond. "The crystalline network. It's not just integrated with Earth's core, Admiral. It's it. We're detecting a shift in the planet's gravitational signature, a deliberate, purposeful alteration." "Explain," K'thari demanded, his hand instinctively moving towards the emergency disruptor strapped to his wrist. "The Juggernaut isn't simply Earth's gravity, it's it. The spire, it's actively drawing energy from the planet, concentrating it, weaving it into this annular, warping structure. We believe it's attempting to create a stable point, a nexus, a seed for something larger." Thorne, who had been meticulously analyzing the seismic data with a grim fascination, finally spoke, his voice a near whisper. "The models, they're no longer accurate. The simulations we ran, the theoretical calculations based on the crystalline network's properties, they were fundamentally flawed. We were assuming a process of creation. This is something else entirely." He gestured to the holographic display, focusing on the intricate patterns forming within the spire's obsidian petals. The geometry isn't just representing gravitational fields, it's representing every curve, every distortion is an iteration, a potential outcome of this convergence. A sudden jarring disruption ripped through the juggernaut systems. A cascade of alarms blared, bathing the command deck in a pulsing red light. "We're losing contact with the planetary sensors," Lieutenant Varkos shouted, his face illuminated by the frantic displays. "The network is becoming sentient. It's resisting our attempts to monitor it. It's listening." K'thari felt a primal surge of fear, a recognition that this wasn't a battle to be won with superior firepower or tactical acumen. This was something older, something fundamentally beyond their comprehension. The human arrogance that had fueled their initial aggression had vanished, replaced by a profound, unsettling humility. "What's it doing?" he asked, his voice a low growl. "It's responding to the harmonic resonance we're generating with the juggernaut," Holloway replied, her eyes glued to the readings. "It's anticipating our actions. It's learning." As if in response to her words, the obsidian spire pulsed with an intensified light, and a new pattern began to emerge within its structure, a complex spiraling configuration that mirrored the original chord Reese had analyzed. But this time, it wasn't a representation of the gravitational field. It was a map of the universe, viewed through an utterly alien perspective. "It's not just a weapon," Thorne said, his voice filled with a chilling realization. "It's a key to unlocking dimensions beyond our understanding." Suddenly, the guttural moan ceased. In its place, a sound emerged, not from the juggernaut speakers, but from the spire itself, a series of perfectly modulated tones, crystalline and hauntingly beautiful. They resonated not just with the ship's systems, but with something deeper, something within the human consciousness, a primal recognition of a truth too terrifying to articulate. "It's communicating," K'thari whispered, his face drained of color. "Not with words, but with resonance." The spire expanded, its obsidian petals reaching outwards, enveloping the juggernaut in a shimmering field of distorted space-time. The last vestiges of the ship's structural integrity seemed to dissolve, as if returning to the raw material from which it had been crafted. And then, a single image coalesced within the heart of the spire, a vast, impossible landscape of swirling nebulae and geometric impossibilities, a vision that transcended space and time, a silent testament to the birth of something truly terrifyingly new. "Tell the Council," the voice echoed, no longer booming, but a delicate, almost sorrowful chime, "that the quarantine is over. Not because they're letting us out, but because we've already moved beyond them."